I'm going to be straight up with you guys because the MacBook Air with the M1 chip, even going into 2022, is a really easy laptop to recommend. Because the fact of the matter is, if you're a normal person looking to do normal everyday tasks on your next laptop, the MacBook Air with the M1 chip effectively covers all of your bases. My name's Ramal, this is my long-term review of the M1 MacBook Air, and let's get right into it. But before I continue, I'd like to address the elephants in the room, being the 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pro, which just received a major redesign, and honestly, these new laptops are stunning. However, I'd just like to mention that if your target budget and target use cases surround the M1 MacBook Air around that $1,000 price range, it's really not worth upselling yourself to the more expensive base model 14-inch MacBook Pro, because even the base model starts at $2,000, which is $1,000 more than the base model M1 MacBook Air, which personally I think is the best laptop for a vast majority of people. But all that being said, I did actually pick up a 16-inch MacBook Pro with the new M1 Pro chip, so if you'd like to see my coverage of that, make sure to subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so don't miss out on any of my future videos. Okay, so there's one thing I want to get straight out of the way, and that is the performance of the M1 MacBook Air, because it seems like it's become kind of this ritual for any review featuring Apple Silicon to be plastered with benchmarks and graphs, and simply, I just don't want to do that. Firstly, if what you're looking for is a deep dive into just the performance aspects of the M1 chip, there are so many far more qualified people on YouTube making excellent reviews of just the M1 chip. And secondly, there's a slight problem with me going over the performance regarding everyday tasks with the M1 MacBook Air. And that problem? Well, it's the fact that the MacBook Air doesn't feel slow at all when doing everyday tasks. The 8-core CPU and the 7 or 8-core GPU, depending on which MacBook Air model you get with the M1 chip, is far and beyond anything you need for everyday tasks on the M1 MacBook Air, because the M1 chip is just in a league of its own when it comes to power versus efficiency, because this chip is both powerful and very efficient. Normal tasks like web browsing, watching videos, consuming content, word processing, spreadsheets, replying to emails, all of that is going to feel buttery smooth with the M1 chip. And if you indulge in hobbies that require a bit more performance like 4K video editing or even photo editing, the M1 MacBook Air will still keep up as long as you're not pushing it too hard. Now, this video that you're watching right now is actually being edited on the M1 MacBook Air, and judging by my past experience with editing 4K video on this machine, everything just glides, especially if you're using software like Final Cut Pro. Overall, in this price and weight class, performance is something you simply do not need to worry about with the M1 MacBook Air. Earlier I mentioned how efficient the M1 chip is, and that really shines through with the battery life, because when you're doing everyday tasks with the screen at almost max brightness, you can expect anywhere from between 8 hours to 12 hours of battery life. And that is really good considering that this laptop is also quite performant for its price and weight class as well. Now, usually when I tell people that the M1 MacBook Air can get around 8 to 12 hours of battery life, that doesn't sound all that impressive. But then when I give a real world example like getting 10 hours of battery life on a Zoom call, that gets people listening. The real world battery life gains of Apple Silicon, and especially with the M1 MacBook Air, is simply staggering, because what that means is you're not going to be married to a wall outlet or a charger, and if you're a student or someone who's really portable with their laptop, you're going to have immense peace of mind because this thing will get you through the day and then some. Another perk afforded to the M1 MacBook Air thanks to the efficiency of the M1 chip is that the thermals on this machine are surprisingly good, considering the fact that this machine is fanless, meaning there's no fan with no fan noise and no sucking in dust. The thermals on this machine are quite cool to the touch under everyday use. Now, what does this mean when it comes to sustained performance, especially if you've got every CPU core and every GPU core firing at 100%? Well, you can expect to have 100% peak performance for around 7 to 8 minutes before the machine starts to throttle. Realistically speaking, you're only going to see that level of power draw if you're doing something like intense 4K video editing, 3D modeling, or compiling a massive chunk of code, because otherwise everyday tasks do not require that much power, so the thermals should be fine for the most part. Alright, so the design. It's pretty basic, which isn't necessarily a bad thing because the build quality with the aluminium chassis is absolutely top notch. You've got a great keyboard, a great trackpad, and the speakers, for what they are on a laptop, are pretty good. However, one of the main downsides to this design is that the connectivity is pretty sparse. You've got 2 USB-C ports which feature Thunderbolt 3 connectivity, and you've got a headphone jack, and that for everyday usage is not exactly enough. A USB-C adapter is pretty much a necessity if you're picking up one of these machines for everyday use, because without USB-A, HDMI, or even an SD card slot, you might find yourself in a bit of trouble if you really need one of those ports. Now, if you are going to be picking up an adapter, you're going to be seeing a ton of adapters like this all over Amazon, but I recommend you pick one with USB-C power pass-through, because what that means is with the same USB-C port, you can get all of these ports back as well as power your machine with the charger that came with the box. And that is a really cool tool, because what that means is you're going to have one USB-C port freed up for whatever purpose you may need. And if you want some recommendations, I'll link some in the description below. Regarding the display, overall it's pretty good. It's 2560 by 1600 over 13.3 inches, so it's plenty sharp in everyday use, and it's also quite color accurate as well, which means that if you're into photo editing or video editing, this is a pretty good machine for hobbyist use. However, I do have a complaint regarding the display on the M1 MacBook Air, and that's the brightness. Indoors, the 500 nit peak brightness is actually pretty good because there's no real harsh lighting indoors, but if you go outside, the reflective display as well as the low brightness means that in sunlight, it's going to be pretty hard to read the display. Once you get into some shade, it's fine, but that's something you'd really want to keep in mind. And above the display, you have a 720p webcam, which going into 2022 is pretty abysmal when it comes to resolution, but at least thanks to the M1 chip and its image signal processing, the actual image you get out of the 720p webcam isn't bad. Now, suffice it to say, I do actually have a lot of lights around me, which definitely helps with the image quality, but overall, it's okay quality. Not amazing, but okay. But the actual microphones that are being used, the studio quality mics that Apple likes to call them, are pretty good, especially when it comes to video conferencing, because this machine is quite apt at video conferencing, especially with the amazing battery life and the decent quality webcam and the great mics. When it comes to software, the MacBook Air with the M1 chip is running macOS, which is no surprise because every single Apple computer runs macOS. This one is running macOS Big Sur, but macOS Monterey is coming out in a couple of days, and if you're thinking of getting a MacBook Air when you're watching this video, you're definitely going to be running macOS Monterey on it. But overall, macOS is a pretty good software experience, and if you've used an iPhone or an iPad, the software experience will be very familiar to you. Now, you might have some questions regarding software and app compatibility, because the M1 chip in the MacBook Air with its ARM architecture requires apps to be developed differently to the Intel Macs of years gone by. But thankfully, compatibility simply is not an issue. For apps that were natively developed to run on Apple Silicon, the experience is going to be fantastic. Really great stability and performance is going to be top notch. And the same thing goes for apps that were originally developed for Intel chips, because the M1 MacBook Air and every Apple Silicon computer in general has a translation layer called Rosetta 2. Basically, the purpose of Rosetta 2 is to translate the app that was originally made for the Intel chip to work natively on Apple Silicon. The way this happens is when you first install an app that was designed for an Intel Mac, there's a bit of a 20 to 30 second delay when opening the app because Rosetta 2 is running in the background and translating the app before you open it on your Apple Silicon Mac. That process doesn't repeat itself once you open the app multiple times, because at that point the app is completely translated and ready to go. So overall, running apps that were made for Intel chips on the M1 MacBook Air is completely flawless. But overall, if you have an M1 MacBook Air, the biggest software asset you have is the synchronicity of the Apple ecosystem. Because if you're already an existing iPhone or iPad owner, getting a MacBook Air is just going to unlock so many more opportunities. Features like AirDrop, iMessage, FaceTime, the ability to answer and reply to phone calls and text messages straight from your Mac are just super convenient. And that's just scratching the surface when it comes to features you get within the Apple ecosystem. And finally, to finish off this review, let's talk about pricing and specs. So the base model M1 MacBook Air starts at $999 US, and for that price you get the M1 chip with the 8-core CPU and 7-core GPU, 256 gigs of storage and 8 GB of RAM. And that is the model I would recommend to almost everyone out there who was looking for a laptop to do everyday tasks and a laptop that performs well over a long period of time. However, if you're looking to do slightly more on your M1 MacBook Air like photo editing and video editing, I would recommend stepping up to the 512 gig model, which unlocks the extra GPU core, and I would also recommend getting 16 gigs of RAM, especially when it comes to future proofing. Now, the price will definitely start to increase when you start upgrading the storage and the RAM, but if you have the cash, I would really recommend upgrading to 16 gigabytes of RAM, because in the long term, like 5 or 6 years, having that extra RAM will help your MacBook Air keep fast long into the future. And even if you decide to resell, the resale value on these new Apple Silicon Macs will be really good, because the Apple Silicon transition so far has been nothing but a success. And of course, when it comes to pricing, make sure to look out for deals, especially education discount, because straight from Apple you can get the base model M1 MacBook Air for $899, which is $100 off the base retail price, which is a really nice saving. And also make sure to look out for deals on Black Friday, Cyber Monday, Christmas, around New Year, because these computers will definitely go on sale and you'd really want to pick one up, especially if the price is right. And that all but concludes my long-term review of the M1 MacBook Air. If you found this video helpful, make sure to give it a huge thumbs up, subscribe for future tech content, and if you have any questions or comments, make sure to leave them in the comment section. And yeah, my name's Ramal, thank you so much for watching, peace out, stay safe, and I'll catch you in the next one.